sort of chairs, not pews. And most of them have actually done their homework. They've seen us online, or they've looked at our website. There's something about how, I know you all don't believe one thing, and you're very inclusive. They say something about being socially progressive in our views, and that we're very social justice focused, and all of that is true. But there's also two important aspects about our faith that most people kind of only learn about over time, and it can be quite confusing if you aren't aware of them. And the two things is that the first thing is that we are a democracy. I'll go into that a little bit here. And the second thing is that we are a faith. So that means that we have a promise together, and I'll go a little bit into that. I believe that Unitarian Universalism can change the world, and I think that change can come about because of these two aspects of our faith. Now, most churches, if you weren't already aware of this, don't operate as a democracy per se. They might have a little bit here or there, but most of our world and our culture just doesn't work that way, right? We live in a very hierarchical world. In other words, we have lots of little dictatorships everywhere in our lives, in our culture. So if you think about it, right, you have a boss, or you are a boss. That's a mini dictatorship. Now, it's a benevolent one, hopefully. That's when you leave your job, if it isn't that way. And there are different levels of managers, right? So hierarchies really are pretty much like pyramids. Oh, there we go. So this is so you've got one or two people at the top, right? And then most of the people, your frontline people, are at the bottom. This is certainly the business model. It's the way that most of our culture works, is you have a hierarchy. Now, the hallmark of democracy is our ability to vote, and in our culture, one doesn't exactly get to do this a lot. We do it, as a culture, once every 2 to 4 years. It's generally not practiced in our home or in our work life, right? I mean, if your children need to do their homework, you don't say, let's take a vote, right? That might be a little bit of a challenge. If your boss wants to get a report, he's not going to say, well, let's take a vote as whether or not you're going to do it. You're going to do it. So these are sort of like, as I say, many benevolent dictatorships that we have in our life, this hierarchical way of doing governance. And dictatorships, the one thing that's good about them is that they're very efficient at getting things done, right? Because you have one person at the top who's saying, this is where we're going, and everybody then goes along with that way. They sort of fall in line. And obviously, this model only works if you have a really good boss. Now, democracies, though, when it's healthy, work on a completely different model. The idea is that those who are put in leadership positions serve the greater good or the people, right? So this is actually the democratic model of governance. So that the people we've elected as leaders, they serve then the people. Now, democracy is only practiced in a few areas of our lives, once every few years, as I said, when we get to vote, or maybe you have it at a board meeting, or, if you're lucky, at a church. And in a lot of churches, they go back to basically this model, and the person who's in charge, usually, not always, is often the minister, or a priest, right, or the pastor. But even they often report to a denominational head. They often have like a bishop, right? Or they have, and then there might be even the archbishop or the pope, depending on which denomination that you're in, right? So everybody has somebody that they report to, and they get to be told what to do. But not so in Unitarian Universalism. This is our model. Here, people are in charge. You do elect people. I'm elected. That's what they call called in a congregation. Nobody came to this congregation and said, you have to take Sean, unlike many other denominations. I went through a very grueling 9-day process of interviews with the entire congregation, all opportunities to talk to me, and then everybody voted on whether or not to call me, right? And then, of course, you have the board, and they serve 1 to 3 year terms with an option to, I think, to continue on some of those terms. So they're kind of the turnover leadership, where I'm kind of the tenured leadership. And in Unitarian Universalism, we are partners in the running of the church. We each have a sort of certain lines of authority, and then we work together on the other things that kind of cross over to each other. So it's obviously very important that your board and your minister get along. And here's the thing is that the denomination, so we do have a sort of a denominational presence, right? That's the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association of congregations. And we have a president. His name is Peter Morales. Lovely guy. And his job, though, he will never come in here and say, congregation, you have to do this. Everything that they do is an invitation. Hey, we're working on Standing on the Side of Love. It's a new program. Come join us if you like. Hey, we're working on Black Lives Matter. Come join us if you like. But each congregation gets to choose what it is that they're going to get involved in and what they would like to, even if they don't want to do that. So whether it's our president or whatever, they're never going to come to a congregation and tell them what to do. This is why we are called Congregationalists. Now, we're not the only Congregationalists. That's what they call our style of governance. Believe it or not, Baptists are similar as well, some of the Baptists. Mennonites are similar as well. There's a few others out there that do serve this way. So the idea is if you're a member, you get to vote on all of these different things, whether it's at the annual meeting, officers, you get to vote on them, vote on the minister when you're calling a new minister. And being a member, in a sense, means that you're the owner, you're the boss, along with about another 150 people, truly. So in that way, our Unitarian Universalist churches, we practice democracy. We try to do this. In fact, we think it's so important that we named it as one of our 7 principles. If you want to know what our principles are, they're on the back sheet of that paper you given when you came in here. I believe it's our 4th principle. I'm not sure. But basically we affirm and promote the use of the democratic process in our congregations and society at large. Because we feel that this is so important. And I believe that democracy is probably the greatest spiritual practice that we have to offer the world. And we rarely get a chance to actually practice it. Now, like all spiritual practices worth their weight, democracy is not easy. Because not everybody's going to do what you want, right? You have to listen to everyone. It's going to push you. It's going to require you to grow and become, and hopefully, someone who is more steady, clear-seeing, and seeking change from a place of love. That's what our reading from our opening words, Reverend Kyoto Williams says. Democracy means you don't always get your way. It means that you have to trust other people, that maybe they're not wholly evil if they don't agree with you. You have to elect good leaders. It's very important to elect good leaders that will hopefully reflect the values that you share and respect the leadership of others that don't. In other words, you don't get to have a coup or a revolution every time something doesn't go your way. Now, that may seem over the top to talk about revolutions and coups, but many countries around the world are really just baffled by us. They're like, wow, so you don't like this person, but you're okay with it. You're going to go along with it. Now, people will battle and they'll march and they'll say certain things, but the fact that we don't have a revolution or coup is kind of amazing for a lot of countries. U.S. democracy, despite all of its challenges, generally means peaceful transfer of power every 4 to 8 years. There's not many countries that can say they have done that. We've been doing it pretty smoothly now, as I said, for about 250 years, and this church has been doing it for about 200 years. Now, I think, however, that as a spiritual practice, our country has gotten rather complacent about it, and we've forgotten about what it means to be a democracy. And we think that voting is really all that we need to do. We just need to go out and plug in. But democracy is more than voting. Voting is really the outcome of someone who does practice democracy. But the skills, the practice of being a democracy are very different. So here's what I think they are, and the skills of being a democracy. 1 is listening. 2, speaking up, right? I can't keep quiet. Now I put loving the opposition. You can choose a different word. Remember, you don't have to like them, just have to love. And of course, participation. And when just one of these things is missing, when we're not good at least one of these things, I think this is when our country gets into trouble. So let's look at one of the first practices is listening, right? I talk a lot about listening. I think it's one of the most powerful things we can do as human beings because communication is always so difficult, right? It's one of the most difficult aspects of being a democracy. The problem is that each side wants to be heard first, right? That's the problem. You need to hear my side first. So each side sort of ends up shouting over the other, and we don't listen. If you want to know who should probably go first, here's a good rule of thumb. The side who gets to be heard first is the one with the least power. The side who gets to be heard first is the one with the least power. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm trying to listen, I'm getting a little triggered by the things that are being said. I want to say, yeah, but. Try not to do the yeah, buts in your head, right? Listening is a skill, and it's not innate to human nature. It really isn't. You have to keep practicing, and you have to keep learning. It means not formulating the answer while you're talking to someone, right? It means not giving advice or arguing with someone. It means hearing all of what they're saying, and not just the words. It's really important to hear the emotions behind the words. Not everybody good is at articulating how they're feeling, but most of the reasons why we argue are emotional reasons. You know, there's lots of books and classes you can take on how to sharpen this skill. Unfortunately, it seems to be that it's only therapists who learn this. I always think that, we should teach this in schools. Now, as progressives, we're supposed to be very inclusive, right? But I think one of our issues is that we don't do this listening very well. We have other gifts, but listening is not our forte always. And it happens particularly when we get angry, and of course it does. That's why it's so hard. And even when the anger is completely justified, we can shut down any dialogue because of that anger. And I want to give you an example from my own childhood and family. So I grew up with parents that were very much activists. And my parents marched for women's rights, civil rights, the environment, all of that. Now, I don't remember going to a lot of marches, but what I do remember when I was younger was the anger that my parents expressed about politics. They always seemed to be angry at those people over there. And this always struck me as sort of a bit odd and incongruous, because after all, they told me that everyone was equal. Everyone should be treated fairly, and everyone deserved to be treated kindly. But here they were belittling people who disagreed with them, calling them stupid, ignorant, or even evil. And as a child, that was confusing to me. What does all mean? Now, my older sister, she's 11 years older than I am, she told me a story one time that pretty much illustrates how this anger affected our family. She said when she was a teenager, she would have been about 15, 16, and I would have been about 4 or 5 years old. She said one night at the dinner tables around 1970, 1971, she said, our mother and father were angrily talking about how awful Nixon was and how much they hated being in the Vietnam War. And they were just wrestling with this and talking and putting everything down and all this sort of thing. And my sister, being a teenager, while I think she pretty much agreed with them, she was being a teenager, she decided to test the boundaries and asked a simple question. What if Nixon's right? She said the coldness that greeted her, it sent a chill down her back. They didn't even say anything. They just stared at her. And she really just shrank down. And that's how it felt in my family. Like, you didn't dare question or say anything, because then you might not be loved. You know, it's interesting, we condemn people who don't love their LGBT children, but it's okay to turn away and condemn a child for asking a question you don't agree with? Yeah, sometimes I think we let our anger get the best of us. And this is what I mean when I say that progressives don't always listen well. And I'm not saying that the other side does any better, by the way. So needless to say, for a long time, well into my adulthood, even though I agreed with most of the liberal or progressive platform, I didn't discuss politics. It was too scary for me, right? Would they see that monster, as our choir sang? Would they turn away? All that hatred and anger that was there. I felt that like it could get me excluded from the love of my own family. And this is why so many people, I think, avoid politics. Now, it took me a long time to figure out how to navigate this anger, and I did figure out how to do it and realize that I needed to meet it with something else like love. I started by listening and being ensuring that others felt heard, and it's not an easy thing, and I'm not saying I did it perfectly or anything like that, but I also learned to give voice to my own anger in a way that was at least helpful, do it in a loving way, to stand up. Because it's hard to speak up, right? It's hard to speak up, particularly if you aren't taught to voice your anger in a healthy way. But that is the second point that we need in a democracy, is you do have to speak up. And it's particularly true for women in our culture, though I think this is changing dramatically. The Women's March was women and allies coming together to give voice in a loving, peaceful way to the opposition that was acting misogynistic and racist. And we do have to speak up. Silence is assumed, by the way, to be agreement. I knew someone once where she had a very conservative family and she herself was very progressive. And all the time she would go to these family gatherings and they would talk about things and she would just get her back up and get more and more tense until finally one day it burst out of her like, please stop talking about that. I don't agree with you. And everybody in her family was shocked. They had no idea. They assumed that she believed as they did. But no one knows me, no one ever will. If I don't say something, if I just lie still, would I be that monster, scare them all away if I let them hear what I have to say? I can't keep quiet. When you do speak up, you may be surprised to find that there are others who agree with you. When you speak up, you give others even the permission to do the same. Now, speaking up does not mean angrily shouting at someone. It doesn't mean calling someone names or putting someone down. It's speaking your own truth in a loving and kind way. It's telling your story. It's speaking up for those who have little or no power. And honestly, generally speaking, we progressives, we do this actually really pretty well, for the most part. I mean, we can work on the loving part of this, but we are good at speaking up. And if we're going to practice democracy, we also have to practice being loving, not necessarily liking, right? Loving the opposition. Now, if you don't like the word loving, some people don't like the word, I like the word love, but if you don't, work on including or accepting. So Paul, yes, that Paul from Corinthians, he wrote a first letter to the Corinthian church about this very problem. He was writing to a community in conflict. From what I understand, there were affairs going on. People were suing one another in the community. Some people thought they were better than others in the community. And this community was trying to figure out how to be together when they disagree about so many different things. So Paul, in teaching them, he goes through a bunch of different stuff. And he teaches them that here's the spiritual gifts of God. And he speaks about the most important one is love. And he wrote this. He says, if I speak in tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all the mysteries and all the knowledge, if I have all the faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, look how great I am, but I do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. Now, I'm not one to normally quote Paul, but he does have occasionally something really interesting to say. He's trying to build a loving community. And he doesn't just tell the Corinthians what they should do, but really he ends this letter about how they should be with one another, how they should treat one another, especially when they disagree. And he's talking about, in a sense, having a covenant together. If you recall, I said that there were two things about people that most people don't know about UU Church. One is that we're a democracy, and the second is that we are a covenantal faith. Let me explain what a covenantal faith means. A covenant is a promise about how we will treat one another. It's not our bylaws, it's not our policies, it's how we are going to treat one another. And it's not a contract, there's no signing in blood. You don't have to hand over your firstborn child or anything like that. It's simply a verbal, heartfelt promise And we say one of those covenants, we have many of them, each week we say, right, when we light our chalice, love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. That's covenantal language. And there's lots of covenants actually around. If you look for them, the board has a covenant, for example, about how to be with one another when they're making decisions. The congregation has voted and passed a covenant of healthy relations as well, about whenever there's conflict among congregants or even with the minister, that there's a way that we can deal with this. It's how we treat one another. You know, we say everyone here is welcome here at this church, right? But not all behaviors are welcome. You don't get to come in and disrupt the service, for example. Covenants address those behaviors. They say, this is how we're going to be together. And I think that one of our problems as a democratic country is that we don't have a covenant. You could argue maybe the Bill of Rights is something like a covenant, but it doesn't tell us how to be with one another. I think covenants would be a really great addition to our democracy, because it's not some legal binding document that you can sue somebody over. It's just a promise. It's a commitment about how we're going to be with one another. So what if our country, just as a way of thinking about it, took our covenant? Love is the spirit of our country, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Might solve some of our problems. Communities, whether or not they are churches or their entire nations, they aren't built when people shy away from difficult topics. They're built when people can talk to one another and address each other's concerns. And this takes a fair bit of trust on each side too. Sometimes it starts with something small, just getting to know another human being on a very real level, like we saw in our video today. You don't tackle necessarily big stuff like politics with someone that you don't know. Start with getting to know the people that you disagree with or hate. You may find that they have a lot in common with you. So one more piece about democracy is that you can't be neutral. You do have to participate. Each of us has to do our part. That's what it means to be part of a community, whether it's a church or a nation. If everyone does just a little, it works, and people will do and give as they are able. Some can do more right now, others will do more later. So you have people like Milk, right, who wrote the song, I Can't Keep Quiet, and then brought it out to the nation to sing, has given this away. There's the Reverend Angela Kyoto Williams, right? She's teaching spiritual centering and spiritual practices to give activist strength. Some of us here, I know, have been sitting in senators' and representatives' offices asking tough questions as part of something called Indivisible. And of course, there's David in our story who threw a stone. Okay, maybe that's not the best way to participate. I'm not saying throw stones. What I liked about this story, the reason why I wanted to tell this story today, is that David didn't defeat this braggart Goliath the way that everyone thought that he should, right? Put on some big armor, take a sword, and go out there and fight him. He did it his own way, right? Each of us needs to find our own way to bring down the Goliath, the hate, right? And in a non-violent way. Each of us plays a part, and together we do make a difference. So however you choose to participate, any little bit that you do helps this world. You know, our nation is really quite young, right? We're in our infancy as a democracy when you consider other forms that have been around. It's kind of a great experiment of the human race. Can and does democracy work? It's going to be up to us, each one of us, to take it seriously and begin doing the spiritual practice of democracy. We can start here in our churches and hopefully then teach the nation. That's why I think Unitarian Universalism is so important. We are the leading edge of how to do religion, but we're also on the leading edge of how to be in community. And along the way, we're going to stumble, we're going to stub our toes, and generally we're going to make mistakes. But as long as we have a covenant, we keep coming back, because that's our promise. And I believe it's the promise of this nation. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.